The wedding hall was filled with flowers, music, and expensive guests. Everyone was smiling, everyone, except Margaret. She stood near the entrance, with both hands wrapped around the strap of her old handbag. Her eyes searched the crowded room. Then, she saw her daughter. Claire looked beautiful. Her white dress seemed to shine under the bright lights. For one small moment, Margaret forgot everything. She smiled. She thought about the little girl Claire had once been, the little girl who used to run into her arms after school, the little girl who used to say, "Mom, you are my whole world." Margaret had spent 27 years raising that girl. She had worked long hours. She had skipped meals. She had worn the same winter coat for years because Claire needed new school clothes. She had never complained. And now, standing at her daughter's wedding, she felt proud. Until Claire saw her. The smile disappeared from the bride's face. Claire stared at her mother's dress. Then at her old handbag. Then at her simple shoes. Her expression changed. She walked quickly across the room. "Mom," she whispered. Margaret smiled. "Claire, you look beautiful." Claire did not smile back. Instead, she looked around nervously. "Why are you dressed like that?" Margaret looked down at herself. It was a simple dark blue dress. Clean. Pressed. Modest. She had bought it 2 weeks earlier because she wanted something nice for her daughter's wedding. "What is wrong with it?" Margaret asked softly. Claire leaned closer. "You were supposed to dress better." Margaret blinked. "I thought this was nice." Claire glanced toward a group of guests. "They're all here." "Who?" "Daniel's family." Margaret looked across the room. She saw Daniel's parents standing beside several well-dressed couples. They were wearing expensive clothes and jewelry. Margaret understood. She suddenly felt uncomfortable. "I can stay in the back," she said. "No one will notice me." Claire shook her head. "That is not the problem." Margaret waited. Claire lowered her voice. "You make me look poor." The words hit Margaret harder than she expected. For a few seconds, she could not speak. "Claire, I told you this was important." "It is important," Margaret said. "That is why I came." Claire sighed. "You don't understand." Margaret looked at her daughter's face. "No," she said quietly. "I don't." Claire looked away. She had changed. Margaret had noticed it over the past year. Claire used to visit every Sunday. Then it became once a month. Then once every few months. She stopped calling unless she needed something. And whenever she visited, she talked about Daniel, Daniel's family, Daniel's friends, Daniel's new apartment, Daniel's business. Money was everywhere in those conversations. Margaret had tried not to judge. She wanted her daughter to be happy. So she stayed quiet. Even when Claire once told her, "You should try to act more sophisticated." Even when Claire complained about the old house. Even when Claire said, "People notice these things, Mom." Margaret had swallowed every hurt because she loved her daughter. But today was different. Today, Claire was asking her to hide. "Claire," Margaret said, "if my dress is embarrassing you, I can leave after the ceremony." Claire looked at her. "No." Margaret frowned. "No. You can't stay for the ceremony either." The music continued behind them. Guests laughed. Someone took pictures. Margaret felt as if the entire room had suddenly become silent. "What are you saying?" Claire took a breath. "I need you to leave." Margaret stared at her. She thought she had heard wrong. "Leave?" "Yes." "Claire, I'm your mother." "I know." "Then why are you asking me to leave your wedding?" Claire's eyes hardened. "Because this wedding is important." Margaret felt tears forming. "So I am not." Claire looked away. That answer hurt more than words. Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. Claire pulled it back. "Please don't make a scene." "A scene?" Margaret almost laughed. She had spent her whole life avoiding scenes. She had raised Claire alone after her husband died. She had worked in a small bakery during the day and cleaned offices at night. She had done everything quietly. And now, at her daughter's wedding, she was being treated like a problem. "I only came because you invited me," Margaret whispered. Claire's face became cold. "I invited my mother." Margaret looked down at her dress. "And I came as your mother." Claire looked toward the entrance. Then she called one of the security men. Margaret's heart dropped. "Claire, don't." The security man approached. Claire pointed toward her mother. "Please escort her outside." Margaret stared at her daughter. The room seemed to spin. "Claire." Her voice broke, but Claire did not move. She did not apologize. She did not even look sad. She simply turned away. The security guard gently asked Margaret to follow him. Margaret held her handbag tightly. She walked through the wedding hall. People watched. Some whispered. Some looked away. One woman covered her mouth. Another guest shook his head. Margaret kept walking. She refused to cry. Not there. Not in front of them. When she reached the doors, she stopped. She looked back one last time. Claire was standing beside Daniel. Daniel whispered something into her ear. Claire nodded. Then she smiled. Margaret finally understood. Her daughter was not ashamed because of the dress. She was ashamed of her. Margaret stepped outside. The doors closed behind her. The music started again. The wedding continued. As if nothing had happened. Margaret walked to her old car. She sat behind the wheel for several minutes. She did not start the engine. Her hands trembled. She looked at the passenger seat. There was a small gift, wrapped in silver paper. She had brought it for Claire. Inside was her father's old watch. It was the only valuable thing Margaret had kept after her husband died. She had planned to give it to Claire during the wedding. Now she slowly picked it up. She stared at it. Then placed it back inside the box. A tear finally rolled down her cheek. But before she could start the car, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. Margaret almost ignored it. Then she answered. Hello. A man's voice replied. Is this Margaret Hayes? Yes. My name is Thomas Reed. I'm an attorney. Margaret wiped her eyes. I'm sorry. I don't know you. I understand. There was a pause. Then he said something that made Margaret sit up straight. I represent your late husband's estate. Margaret's heart began beating faster. My husband has been dead for 12 years. I know. Then why are you calling me now? The attorney took a breath. Because something has happened involving the property. Margaret looked toward the wedding hall. What property? The house you currently live in. Margaret frowned. My house? Yes. She became confused. What about it? The attorney lowered his voice. Mrs. Hayes, has your daughter ever asked you to sign papers about that house? Margaret froze. She thought about the last 6 months. Claire asking about the house. Claire asking how much the land was worth. Claire saying the neighborhood was changing. Claire telling her that she should move somewhere smaller. Claire even asking whether her father had left any documents. Margaret had thought those questions were harmless. Now they felt different. Yes, Margaret whispered. She has. The attorney became silent for a moment. Then he asked, did she tell you why? Margaret looked at the wedding hall again. Her daughter was still inside. Celebrating. Smiling. Marrying into a wealthy family. And Margaret suddenly remembered something Claire had said 3 months earlier. Mom, you should really let me handle the house. I know what is best for you. Margaret had thought it was concerned. Now she wasn't so sure. No, Margaret finally said. She never told me why. The attorney's voice became serious. Then I think you need to hear this before you speak to her again. Margaret gripped the phone. What happened? There are documents here with your daughter's name on them. Margaret's breath caught. What documents? The attorney paused. Then he said, documents stating that your daughter already has permission to sell your property. Margaret went completely still. She looked at the wedding hall one more time. The same daughter who had just thrown her out because she was too simple might have been planning to take the one thing Margaret had left. But there was something Claire didn't know. Something even Margaret herself had forgotten. And it was hidden inside an old box in her late husband's study. Something that could change everything. The attorney's next words made Margaret's hands go cold. Double quotes Mrs. Hayes. Before you do anything else, you need to find that box. Margaret stared ahead. What box? The attorney answered quietly. The one your husband told me never to open unless Claire tried to take the house. Margaret's face went pale, because she had never told anyone about that box. And suddenly, the wedding was no longer the worst thing that had happened that day. It was only the beginning. Margaret remained inside her car. She could still hear the faint sound of wedding music coming from the hall, but she no longer cared about the wedding. Her mind was fixed on one thing. The box her husband had apparently left behind. The box she had completely forgotten. What is in it? She asked. Thomas Reed did not answer right away. I can't discuss everything over the phone, he said. Not yet. Then tell me what I need to know. Thomas sighed. Your husband came to my office 11 years ago. Margaret's eyes widened. 11 years ago? Yes. That makes no sense. It will when you see the documents. Margaret looked toward the old house in the distance. Her house had been quiet for years. She had never thought of it as something valuable. It was simply where she had lived, where she had raised Claire, where her husband had once sat at the kitchen table every morning. The house was old, the paint was fading, the floors creaked, the kitchen cabinets were worn. To Margaret, it was home. But apparently, someone else saw something very different. What did my husband tell you? She asked. Thomas lowered his voice. He told me that one day, someone might try to convince you that the property belonged to them. Margaret's stomach tightened. Did he say who? Yes. Who? Thomas paused. Claire. Margaret closed her eyes. She had expected many things from that day. She had not expected this. My husband knew. He was worried. About Claire. About what money could do to her. Margaret looked down at her hands. Her wedding ring was still on her finger. She had worn it every day since her husband died. She remembered him sitting beside her on the hospital bed. She remembered his weak smile. She remembered him telling her, "Take care of yourself, Margaret." She had never imagined he had been preparing for something like this. "Where is the box?" she asked. "In the house." "Where?" Thomas gave her an exact location. Then he said, "But Margaret, do not tell Claire about this conversation." Margaret looked back at the wedding hall. "I won't. And don't sign anything. I won't. One more thing." "What?" "If Claire calls you tonight, don't argue with her." Margaret frowned. "Why?" "Because she may not know that I have contacted you." Margaret's heart began beating faster. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that you should listen carefully to whatever she tells you." Then Thomas ended the call. Margaret sat silently. For the first time, she wondered how much of her daughter's wedding had been planned around money. She started the car, but she did not drive home immediately. She waited. Then she saw Claire walk outside. Daniel followed her. They stood near the entrance. Claire was laughing. Daniel kissed her forehead. Margaret watched them from a distance. Then Claire looked toward the parking lot. For 1 second, her eyes met her mother's. Claire looked away. Margaret drove off. She did not go home. Instead, she went to her sister's apartment. Her sister, Helen, opened the door and immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" Margaret tried to answer. Nothing came out. Helen pulled her inside. Margaret finally broke down. Not loudly. Not dramatically. She simply sat at the kitchen table and cried. Helen held her hand. When Margaret finally told her everything, Helen looked stunned. "I always knew Claire was changing," Helen said, "but I never thought she would do this." Margaret shook her head. "She may not have done anything yet." Helen stared at her. "Then why would the lawyer call?" Margaret had no answer. She only knew she needed to find that box. An hour later, Margaret returned home. The house was dark. She turned on the hallway light. Everything looked exactly as she had left it. The old clock on the wall, her husband's framed photograph, the small wooden cabinet. Nothing seemed different. But Margaret no longer looked at the house the same way. She went upstairs. Her husband's study had been untouched for years. She opened the door. Dust covered the desk. Books were still arranged exactly as he had left them. Margaret walked toward the old cabinet. She opened the bottom drawer. Nothing. She checked another. Nothing. Then she remembered something. The floorboard near the desk had always been loose. Her husband used to joke about it. Margaret knelt down. She moved the small rug. There it was, a narrow gap in the wooden floor. Her hands began shaking. She pulled the board up. Underneath was a small metal box. Margaret stared at it. She had never seen it before. There was no key. Instead, there was a small combination lock. 3 numbers. Margaret thought for a moment. Then she entered the date of her wedding. The lock opened. Inside were several documents. An old photograph, a letter, and a second set of property papers. Margaret picked up the photograph first. It showed her husband standing in front of the house, but there was something strange. Behind him stood a sign. Margaret had never noticed it before. The sign belonged to a development company. She turned the photograph over. There was a handwritten note. "This land will be worth far more than anyone realizes." Margaret's breathing became shallow. She opened the property papers. Her eyes moved slowly across the page. The land was much larger than she had believed. The house sat on only a small portion of it. The rest stretched behind the property. And according to the documents, her husband had purchased the entire parcel years before. Margaret whispered, "How much is this worth?" Then she saw another document. Her hands froze. It was an agreement from a development company. They had offered her husband a huge amount of money for the land. He had refused, but the date was strange. The offer had been made 11 years ago, the same year he visited Thomas Reed. Margaret picked up the letter. It was addressed to her. She opened it. The first line made her heart ache. "My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, something has gone wrong." She sat down. Her eyes filled with tears. Her husband explained that he had discovered the land could become extremely valuable. He feared that Claire might one day be approached by people who wanted the property. He did not accuse Claire. He simply wrote that he wanted to protect Margaret. Then came the part that made Margaret stop breathing. "The property is yours, not Claire's. Not anyone else's." Margaret covered her mouth. Her husband had placed the entire property under her name. But there was more. He had created a legal condition. Claire could never sell the property without Margaret's written approval. And if anyone tried to pressure Margaret into signing, the agreement would become void. Margaret slowly lowered the letter. Suddenly, everything made sense. Claire's questions, the pressure, the sudden interest in the house. The wedding, the wealthy family. The expensive plans. It was not about a simple dress. It had never been about the wedding. Someone wanted the land. Someone believed Margaret was standing in the way. Her phone suddenly rang. Margaret jumped. The screen showed Claire's name. She stared at it. Thomas had warned her. "Listen. Do not argue." Margaret answered. "Hello." Claire sounded annoyed. "Mom, where are you?" "I'm home." "No, you're not." Margaret said nothing. Claire continued. "You left without saying goodbye." Margaret almost laughed. "You told me to leave. I was angry. You had security remove me." "I know." There was silence. Then Claire's voice softened. "Mom, I am sorry." Margaret's eyes narrowed. The apology sounded strange. To quick. To careful. "Why?" Margaret asked. "Because I was stressed." Margaret looked at the papers on the desk. "Is that all?" "Yes." Claire hesitated. Then she said something that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Mom, I need you to sign something tomorrow." Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone. "What?" "It's just paperwork." "What paperwork?" Claire became impatient. "About the house." Margaret looked at the old deed lying on the desk. "What about the house?" "Daniel's family has a beer." Margaret said nothing. Claire continued. "They want to move quickly." Margaret stared at the photograph of her husband. "And if I don't sign?" Claire's voice changed. For the first time, there was no softness. "Then you're going to make everything very difficult." Margaret felt something inside her break. "Claire," she said quietly, "who told you that you own my house?" Silence. A long silence. Then Claire whispered, "What did you just say?" Margaret did not answer. Claire's breathing became faster. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Margaret looked at the documents. Then she remembered Thomas's warning. She decided not to reveal what she had found. "Nothing," she said. Claire paused. Then her voice became cold. "You need to sign those papers tomorrow." "We'll talk tomorrow." "No." Margaret frowned. Claire's voice was suddenly firm. "You will sign them." The call ended. Margaret slowly placed the phone on the desk. She stared at it. Her daughter had not asked. She had ordered her. Then Margaret noticed something else. A small envelope had fallen from the metal box. It had been hidden beneath the property documents. There was only one sentence written across it. Margaret opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a copy of a document. She read the first paragraph. Then the second. Her face went completely pale. Because the document did not only protect the house. It revealed that Claire had already tried to sell something she did not own, and someone had already paid her for it. Margaret looked toward the door. For the first time that night, she felt afraid. Not of losing her house, but of what her daughter might do when she discovered the truth. Margaret read the document again. Then again. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Claire had already signed an agreement with a development company. The agreement said that Margaret's property would be transferred after the wedding. But there was one problem. Claire was not the owner. She had never been the owner. Margaret's name was clearly written on the official deed. Yet Claire had signed as if she had full control. Margaret's hands began to shake. She looked at the date. The agreement had been signed 3 months earlier. 3 months. That was before Claire had asked Margaret about the house, before the wedding invitations, before Claire had started talking about money, before she had looked at her mother's clothes and called them embarrassing. Margaret suddenly understood. Claire had been planning this for months. The wedding was not the beginning. It was only the moment Margaret finally saw the truth. She picked up her phone and called Thomas. He answered quickly. Margaret, she already signed it. I know. Margaret froze. You knew? We discovered the agreement yesterday. Yesterday? Yes. Then why didn't you tell me? Thomas was silent for a moment. Because I needed to confirm something first. What? That Claire did not act alone. Margaret stopped breathing for a second. What do you mean? Thomas lowered his voice. The development company would never have accepted Claire's signature without someone giving them confidence that the property could be transferred. Margaret looked toward the window. Daniel, I don't know yet. Then who? I think you should come to my office tomorrow. Margaret wanted answers immediately, but Thomas refused to discuss more over the phone. After the call ended, Margaret sat alone in the study. The house was silent. She could hear the old clock ticking. Every sound seemed louder than before. She looked at her husband's photograph. I don't understand, she whispered. For years, she had believed her family was simple. Her husband had worked hard. She had worked hard. They had never chased money. They had simply wanted a quiet life. And now money had turned their daughter against them. Margaret stayed in the study until almost midnight. Then she heard something downstairs, a soft sound, like a door opening. She stood still. Her heart began pounding. Someone was inside the house. Margaret slowly picked up her phone. She did not turn on the light. Another sound came from downstairs, a drawer opening, then footsteps. Margaret moved toward the hallway. She stopped at the top of the stairs. A dark figure stood below. The person was going through the cabinet near the front door. Margaret covered her mouth. She knew that shape. She knew that posture. It was Claire. Margaret switched on the light. Claire turned around. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. What are you doing here? Margaret asked. Claire looked frightened, then angry. I forgot something. At midnight. Claire looked toward the cabinet. My wedding documents. Margaret slowly walked down the stairs. You could have called me. I did. You called about the house. Claire's face changed. Margaret saw it. Fear. Just for a second. Then Claire recovered. You're acting strange. Margaret stared at her. So are you. Claire folded her arms. Mom, I told you I am under a lot of pressure. Who is pressuring you? No one. Then why are you trying to sell my property? Claire's face went pale. I am not. Margaret held up the document. You signed this. Claire looked at the paper. Her mouth opened. No words came out. Margaret felt tears in her eyes. Why? Claire finally whispered. You wouldn't understand. Try me. Claire looked down. Daniel needs it. Margaret stared at her daughter. Daniel needs my house? It isn't like that. Then what is it like? Claire began crying. He has debts. Margaret said nothing. His family business is in trouble. Claire continued. They need money. How much? Claire looked away. Millions. Margaret felt sick. And you thought my house would solve it. They said the land was valuable. Who said? Claire did not answer. Daniel. Another silence. Margaret stepped closer. Claire, look at me. Claire slowly raised her eyes. Did you marry him because of money? Claire shook her head. No. But her voice was weak. Margaret did not believe her. Claire wiped her tears. He loves me. Then why does he need my house? He doesn't want your house. Then who does? Claire's silence answered the question. Margaret sat down. She felt exhausted. For years, she had protected Claire from hardship. Now Claire was standing in her house at midnight, trying to take away the one thing her mother had left. Margaret whispered, Did Daniel know you signed the agreement? Claire nodded. And his parents? Another nod. Margaret closed her eyes. The betrayal was bigger than she had imagined. But then Claire said something unexpected. They told me you would never find out. Margaret opened her eyes. Who told you that? Claire suddenly realized she had said too much. She stepped back. I have to go. Margaret stood. No. Claire looked toward the door. Mom, please. You came into my house in the middle of the night. I said I was sorry. No. You said you were stressed. Claire began crying again. Margaret's voice softened. Tell me the truth. Claire looked broken. They said you were old. Margaret's face changed. They said what? They said you wouldn't understand the value of the property. Margaret felt something inside her collapse. They thought I was too old to know what was happening. Claire nodded. And they said once the wedding was over, you would sign. Margaret stared at her. The wedding. That explained the urgency. They had expected Margaret to feel emotional. They expected Claire to pressure her while she was still celebrating her daughter's marriage. They had planned everything. Margaret suddenly understood why Claire had been so desperate to get the papers signed. The wedding had been a deadline. The development company wanted the property. Daniel's family needed the money. And Margaret was the only obstacle. Claire walked toward the door. Before she left, Margaret asked one final question. Did Daniel know you were going to throw me out today? Claire stopped. She did not turn around. Yes. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. That answer hurt more than anything else. Daniel had watched her being humiliated. He had known. And he had done nothing. Claire left. The front door closed. Margaret stood alone. She walked back upstairs. Her legs felt weak. She returned to the study and sat beside the desk. Then she noticed the envelope again. There was another paper inside. She had missed it earlier. It was a copy of an email. The message was between Daniel and someone from the development company. Margaret read it slowly. The first line said, "Once the mother signs, the daughter will receive her share." Margaret's heart stopped. Her eyes moved down. The next sentence was worse. "Claire has agreed to cooperate." Margaret's hands began trembling. She kept reading. Then she reached the final paragraph. "If she refuses, we can use the information about her father's estate." Margaret froze. What information? What did they know about her husband? She immediately called Thomas. He answered. "Margaret." "Thomas, they know about my husband." There was silence. "What exactly did you find?" Margaret told him. Thomas took a deep breath. "I was afraid of this. What did my husband do?" "Nothing illegal." "Then why are they threatening me?" "They may not be threatening you." Margaret frowned. "Then what?" "They may be threatening Claire." Margaret's heart tightened. "What do you mean?" Thomas hesitated. "Your husband left behind more than the property." Margaret stood up. "What else did he leave?" "Records." "About what?" "About Daniel's family." Margaret stared at the old photograph. "Why would my husband have records about them?" "Because he investigated them years ago." Margaret felt cold. "Why?" Thomas was silent. Then he finally said, "Because Daniel's father was once connected to a company that tried to take your husband's land." Margaret's eyes widened. The story was no longer about a wedding. It was no longer only about Claire. There had been another fight years ago, a fight her husband had kept hidden. And somehow, Daniel's family had returned. Thomas continued. "Margaret, there is something else you need to know." "What?" "The agreement Claire signed isn't the only document." Margaret gripped the phone. "What other document?" Thomas lowered his voice. "There is a second contract." "What does it say?" "It says that if you refuse to transfer the property." He stopped. Margaret waited. "Claire becomes personally responsible for a very large debt." Margaret's face went pale. She suddenly understood why Claire had been acting so strangely. Her daughter was not simply greedy, she was trapped, but that raised an even bigger question. Who had trapped her? Margaret looked toward the bedroom where Claire had once slept as a child. For the first time, she wondered whether her daughter had betrayed her willingly, or whether someone had been controlling her from the beginning. Then Thomas said the words that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Margaret, I think Claire may be in danger." The line went silent, and Margaret realized that the woman who had thrown her out of the wedding might now be the same woman who needed her mother's help to survive. Margaret did not sleep that night. Thomas's final words kept repeating in her mind. Claire might be in danger. For hours, Margaret sat beside the window. She could have been angry. She could have ignored Claire. After what happened at the wedding, no one would have blamed her. But Margaret was still a mother. Even after everything Claire had done, she could not stop worrying about her. At 6 in the morning, Margaret called Thomas. "I need to know everything." Thomas agreed. "Come to my office." Margaret drove across town. When she arrived, Thomas was waiting with 3 thick folders. He looked more serious than before. "These are not easy things to hear," he said. Margaret sat down. "I don't care." Thomas opened the first folder. Daniel's father, Richard Cole, owned a construction company 15 years ago. Margaret listened. He had financial problems. Serious ones. What happened? "He lost several properties." Margaret frowned. "And my husband." "Your husband bought one of them." Margaret's eyes widened. "Which one?" Thomas pointed to a map. It was the land where Margaret's house stood. Her husband had purchased the property at a legal sale. Richard had tried to challenge the purchase, but he lost. Thomas continued. "Richard never forgot that." Margaret stared at the map. So this is revenge, maybe. And Daniel grew up hearing his father's version of the story. Margaret felt sick. She had thought Daniel was simply a wealthy man who wanted her daughter. But he had a history with her family, a history she had never known. Thomas opened the second folder. This is where it gets worse. Inside were copies of bank records and business documents. Margaret did not understand all of them, but one name appeared again and again. Daniel Cole. He has debts, she asked. More than debts. Thomas pointed to several pages. His company owes millions. Margaret slowly looked up. And the property could solve most of it. Margaret understood. Daniel did not need the house because he wanted to build a home there. He needed the land because it could save his family, and Claire. Thomas leaned back. She signed a personal guarantee. Margaret's face fell. What does that mean? If the property deal fails, the development company can demand the money from Claire. Margaret closed her eyes. How much? Thomas gave her the number. Margaret's stomach tightened. It was an amount Claire could never repay. She would lose everything. Possibly. Margaret looked down at the papers. For the first time, she understood why Claire had been desperate. But understanding did not erase what she had done. Claire had still lied. She had still signed papers behind her mother's back. She had still allowed her mother to be humiliated. And she had still planned to take the house. Margaret looked at Thomas. What happens if I refuse? The deal collapses. And Claire? She may be sued. Margaret became silent. Thomas watched her carefully. You don't have to decide today. Margaret shook her head. No. She looked at the folders. I do. Thomas raised an eyebrow. I know what I have to do. What? Margaret's voice was calm. I am not giving them the property. Thomas nodded. I expected that. But I am not going to let Claire be destroyed either. Thomas leaned forward. What are you planning? Margaret looked at him. I want to know who is behind this. Thomas was silent. Margaret continued. Daniel may have debts. Richard may hate my husband. But someone helped Claire sign those papers. Yes. Someone told her I would cooperate. Yes. Someone knew about the old property. Thomas nodded. Margaret's eyes hardened. I want proof. Thomas smiled slightly. Then we begin with the development company. Over the next few days, Margaret did something Claire never expected. She disappeared. She did not call Claire. She did not answer Daniel. She did not return to the wedding hall. Instead, she worked quietly with Thomas. They gathered every document they could find. They contacted the development company. They reviewed the agreement Claire had signed. They found several strange details. The company had received information about the property before Claire had supposedly learned its value. Someone had sent them private details. Details that only a small number of people could have known. Margaret studied the papers. Who had access to this? Thomas pointed to the list. Claire. Margaret nodded. Daniel. Yes. Richard Cole. Yes. She looked at another name. Who is Evelyn Shaw? Thomas paused. That is the question. Margaret looked at him. Who is she? She works for the development company. What does she do? She handles private property deals. Margaret studied the photograph attached to the file. Evelyn was a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair. There was something familiar about her face. Margaret could not explain why. Then she remembered. She had seen that woman at the wedding, standing beside Daniel's parents. Margaret's stomach turned. This wasn't just Daniel's plan. No, Thomas said. It was organized. Thomas nodded. Margaret leaned back. Suddenly, she remembered something else. 3 weeks before the wedding, Claire had asked her to meet someone, a woman who claimed to be a financial advisor. Margaret had refused. She had been too busy. Now she wondered if that woman had been Evelyn. Thomas agreed to investigate. The next morning, he called Margaret. She was. Margaret closed her eyes. How long have they been planning this? Almost a year. A year. Margaret felt betrayed all over again. Claire had been planning her wedding while also planning to take her mother's property. But Thomas was not finished. There is more. What? Evelyn wasn't hired by Daniel. Margaret frowned. Then who hired her? Thomas paused. Richard Cole. Margaret stared at the phone. Daniel's father. The man who had lost the property years ago. The man who had blamed Margaret's husband. He had been behind everything. Margaret finally understood the larger picture. Richard had waited. He had watched. He had waited until his son became close to Claire. Then he had used their marriage to get close to the property. The wedding was part of the plan. Margaret's humiliation was not random. They needed her isolated. They wanted her to feel small. They wanted her to believe she had no power. And they had almost succeeded. Margaret looked out the window. Then she smiled. It was the first real smile she had given since the wedding. Thomas noticed. "What are you thinking?" Margaret answered calmly. "They made one mistake." "What mistake?" "They thought I would fight them emotionally." She picked up the old deed. "I am going to fight them legally." Thomas nodded. "But we need more evidence." "We will get it." "How?" Margaret thought for a moment. Then she remembered Claire's phone call. Claire had said Daniel needed the property, but Claire had also said something else. "They told me you would never find out." Margaret looked at Thomas. "I need to speak to Claire." Thomas immediately shook his head. "Be careful. I won't tell her what we found." "What will you tell her?" Margaret's eyes remained fixed on the deed. "I will let her think I am still afraid." Thomas understood. They needed Claire to reveal what she knew. And there was only one way to do that. Margaret agreed to meet Claire at a quiet restaurant. Claire arrived 20 minutes late. She looked exhausted. Her wedding ring was still on her finger, but her face no longer looked happy. Margaret watched her sit down. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Finally Claire whispered, "Mom, I'm sorry." Margaret looked at her. "I know." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want things to happen this way, but they did. I was scared." "Of what?" Claire looked around. Then she lowered her voice. "Of Daniel's father." Margaret's heart skipped. "Why?" Claire shook her head. "I can't tell you." "Claire, I can't." Margaret stayed calm. Then she said something she knew would frighten her daughter. "I know about the agreement." Claire's face went white. Margaret continued. "I know about the development company." Claire stopped breathing for a moment. "And I know about your father's debts." Claire looked down. Margaret leaned closer. "Now tell me what I don't know." Claire's hands began shaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. Then help me understand." Claire looked toward the restaurant entrance. Her fear was obvious. "Finally," she whispered, "Daniel's father told me something about your husband." Margaret's heart began pounding. "What?" Claire swallowed. "He said your husband did something to him." Margaret stared at her. "What did he say?" Claire looked terrified. "He said your husband stole something from him." Margaret shook her head. "That isn't true. I don't know." "Claire, what did he say?" Claire finally looked directly into her mother's eyes. "He said your father was not the real owner of the land." Margaret froze. "My husband." Claire nodded. "He said your husband got the property through a secret deal." Margaret's face went pale. She suddenly understood why Richard had spent years trying to get the land back. But there was one problem. Margaret had the original records. She knew her husband had bought it legally. So why would Richard claim otherwise? Claire reached across the table. "Mom, please." "What?" "Don't fight them." "Why?" Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Because they told me what they would do if you did." Margaret's heart tightened. "What did they threaten?" Claire whispered the answer. "They said they would destroy Daniel." Margaret stared at her. Then Claire said something even worse. "And if that didn't work," she looked toward the window, "they said they would come after you." Margaret felt a cold wave move through her body. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she slowly reached for her handbag. Inside was the original deed. She touched it through the leather. They thought she was helpless. They thought she would surrender. They had no idea what her husband had left behind. Margaret looked at Claire. "Go home tonight." Claire frowned. "Why?" "Because I need you to do something." "What?" "Don't tell Daniel that we spoke." Claire looked confused. Margaret drove home without turning on the radio. Her hand stayed firmly on the steering wheel. Her mind was racing. The man in the restaurant had been watching them. Someone already knew about the plan. Someone knew Margaret was pretending to cooperate. That meant she could no longer trust anyone. Not even Claire. When Margaret reached home, she locked every door. Then she called Thomas. "They know." Thomas became silent. "Who?" "I don't know." Margaret told him what happened at the restaurant. Thomas listened carefully. When she finished, he said, "Then we changed the plan." Margaret looked at the old deed on the table. "No." Thomas frowned. "No. We don't change it." "Margaret, they know you're suspicious." "Maybe. Then, signing anything could be dangerous." Margaret shook her head. "I'm not going to sign the transfer." Thomas understood. "You want them to believe you will." "Yes." "And what happens at the meeting?" Margaret looked at the clock. "We find out who is behind them. Thomas agreed to arrange the meeting. The next morning, Margaret received a call from Daniel. His voice sounded unusually friendly. Mrs. Hayes. Margaret almost laughed. He had never called her that before. Daniel, I heard you spoke with Claire. Yes, she told me you're ready to cooperate. Margaret paused. I am considering it. Daniel's voice brightened. That's wonderful. I have one condition. What is it? I want everyone there. Daniel hesitated. Everyone. Your parents, of course. The development company. Another pause. Yes. And Evelyn Shaw. Daniel became quiet. Margaret knew immediately. He had not expected her to mention Evelyn. Why her? She handled the documents. Daniel recovered quickly. Fine. Margaret smiled faintly. Then we have a meeting. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. Thomas prepared everything. He brought copies of the original deed. He brought the old agreements. He also brought documents proving Margaret's legal ownership. But there was one thing Margaret did not tell him. She had found another envelope in her husband's box. She had not opened it yet. The envelope was marked, "Only if they claim I stole the property." Margaret carried it in her handbag. She wanted to open it in front of them. If Richard Cole was going to tell his version of the past, Margaret wanted her husband's words to answer him. The meeting took place in a private office downtown. Margaret arrived first. Daniel was already there. His parents sat beside him. Richard looked older than Margaret remembered, but his eyes were cold. Evelyn sat across the table. She smiled when Margaret entered. Mrs. Hayes. Margaret nodded. Double quotes. Evelyn. Double quotes. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Richard stood. Margaret. She looked at him. I haven't seen you since the funeral. Margaret remembered. Richard had come to her husband's funeral. He had stood near the back. He had not said a word. Now she wondered why. Richard pointed toward a chair. Please sit. Margaret did. Thomas sat beside her. Daniel looked nervous. His mother kept checking her phone. Finally, Evelyn placed a stack of papers on the table. These are the final transfer documents. Margaret looked at them. You said the deal was ready. It is. Then why do you need my signature? Evelyn smiled. Because you're the current owner. Margaret looked at Richard. Current owner. Richard leaned forward. You know the history. No. Margaret said. I don't. Richard's expression hardened. Your husband took that land from my family. Thomas immediately spoke. That claim has no legal basis. Richard ignored him. Your husband knew the property belonged to us. Margaret shook her head. He bought it legally. He manipulated the sale. Do you have proof? Richard stared at her. I have records. Then show them. The room became quiet. Richard slowly placed a folder on the table. Margaret's heart began beating faster. She had expected this, but she had not expected what she saw. The folder contained old property documents. Some of them looked real. One page appeared to show a private agreement between her husband and Richard. Margaret stared at the signature. It looked like her husband's handwriting. For a moment, she felt confused. Thomas leaned closer. Don't react. Margaret stayed still. Richard smiled. You see? Margaret looked at him. I see a copy. Richard's smile disappeared. Where is the original? You tell me. Margaret opened her handbag. Then she removed the envelope. Richard's face changed. What is that? My husband left it for me. She opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Margaret began reading. Her husband's words were clear. He explained that Richard had once tried to make a private deal with him, but Richard wanted Margaret's husband to lie about the true value of the land. He refused. Richard then tried to force the sale. Again, he refused. The final paragraph was the most important. I bought the land through a legal sale. Every payment was recorded. Every document was witnessed. Margaret looked up. Richard's face had gone pale. Thomas immediately asked for the original records. Margaret placed them on the table. Richard's old documents suddenly looked weak. Evelyn picked up one page. This is not what we were given. Thomas looked at her. What were you given? Evelyn froze. Margaret watched her carefully. There it was, the crack, the first sign that someone had lied to everyone. Daniel looked at his father. Dad. Richard stood. Enough. No. Daniel said. Sit down. Daniel stared at him. You told me this property was stolen. Richard's face became red. You don't understand. I understand that we could lose everything because of this. Margaret looked at Daniel. You were never told the truth. Daniel turned toward her. What do you mean? Your father knew the property was legally purchased. Richard shouted. Don't listen to her. Thomas stood. Mr. Cole, we have records showing you knew about the purchase. Richard stopped. Thomas placed another document on the table. This is your signed acknowledgement. Richard stared at it. Daniel looked at his father. You knew. Richard said nothing. The room fell silent. Then Evelyn suddenly stood. I want no part of this. Richard looked at her. You're staying? No. She grabbed her bag. You told us the property could be transferred. I said it could. You said the mother had agreed. Margaret watched her carefully. I never agreed. Evelyn looked frightened. Then she said something that changed everything. Richard told me you had already signed a power of attorney. Margaret's blood ran cold. I never signed one. Evelyn looked at Richard. You lied to Emmy. Richard's expression became dangerous. Sit down. Evelyn stepped backward. No. She left the room. Daniel looked completely lost. His mother began crying. Margaret felt no satisfaction, only sadness. Her daughter had married into this. She had trusted these people. And now she was watching their world collapse. But Margaret was not finished. She turned toward Claire's empty chair. Where is my daughter? Daniel looked at her. She didn't come. Why? I don't know. Margaret knew something was wrong. She immediately called Claire. No answer. Again. No answer. Then a message appeared. It was from Claire. Only 6 words. Mom, don't sign anything. Please. Margaret's heart dropped. She showed Thomas. He read it. Call her. I am. Margaret tried again. This time, someone answered, but it wasn't Claire. It was a man. Margaret froze. Who is this? The man said nothing. Then he whispered, your daughter should have listened. The call ended. Margaret stood up. Where is Claire? Daniel looked terrified. I don't know. Margaret turned toward Richard. You know. Richard said nothing. Thomas immediately called the police. But before anyone could leave, Margaret's phone received another message. This time, there was an image. Margaret opened it. Her face went pale. It showed Claire sitting in a dark room. Her hands were tied. And beside her was a handwritten note. Bring the original deed. Margaret could barely breathe. Thomas took the phone from her. We need to call the police. Now. Margaret nodded. Then she noticed something in the photograph. A small wooden clock on the wall. She recognized it. It belonged to an old warehouse. Her husband had once used the same warehouse mentioned in the papers. Margaret looked at Thomas. I know where they took her. Richard suddenly moved toward the door. Thomas blocked him. Where are you going? Richard's face was empty. I have nothing to do with this. Margaret looked at him. Then she noticed his hands. They were trembling. She understood. Richard knew exactly where Claire was. And if Margaret wanted her daughter back, she would have to face the man who had been planning this revenge for years. But there was one thing Margaret still did not know. Richard had not ordered Claire's kidnapping. Someone else had. And that person was much closer to the family than Margaret could ever have imagined. Margaret stared at the photograph on her phone. Claire was sitting in a dark room. Her hands were tied. Her face looked frightened. Margaret's heart felt like it was breaking. But she forced herself to stay calm. She could not panic. Not now. Thomas was already calling the police. Daniel stood beside the table, completely pale. His mother was crying. Richard remained silent. Margaret looked directly at him. You know where she is? Richard shook his head. I told you. I have nothing to do with this. Margaret stepped closer. You know something? Richard looked away. Thomas ended the call. The police are on their way. Margaret nodded. Then she looked at the photograph again. The old wooden clock was visible behind Claire. She knew that clock. Her husband had kept it inside an old warehouse on the edge of town. It had been empty for years. Margaret grabbed her coat. Thomas stopped her. You are not going there alone. I won't. I mean it. Margaret looked at Daniel. He is coming. Daniel looked shocked. Me? Yes. Why? Because Claire is your wife. Daniel swallowed. Then he nodded. Richard suddenly spoke. I know the warehouse. Everyone turned toward him. Margaret stared at him. Then you're coming too. Richard shook his head. No. Margaret's voice became firm. If Claire is hurt because of something your family started, you are coming. Richard looked at her for several seconds. Finally, he stood. I'll show you the way. They left the office together. Thomas followed in another car. The drive was silent. Margaret sat beside Daniel. Richard drove. Daniel kept looking at his phone. No new messages came. Margaret noticed his hands shaking. Daniel. He looked at her. I am sorry. She said nothing. I should have protected her. Margaret looked out the window. You should have protected both of us. Daniel lowered his eyes. I know. After 20 minutes, they reached the old warehouse. It looked exactly as Margaret remembered. Broken windows, rusty doors, tall weeds around the walls. Richard parked the car. Margaret stepped out. The building was completely dark. Thomas arrived moments later. The police were close behind. Richard pointed toward a side entrance. She may be inside. Margaret looked at him. How do you know? Richard didn't answer. Thomas immediately noticed. You've been here before. Richard remained silent. The police entered first. Everyone waited outside. Then a voice came from inside. She's here. Margaret ran toward the door. Thomas caught her arm. Wait. The officers brought Claire outside. Her hands were free. She was crying. Margaret rushed to her. Claire collapsed into her mother's arms. For a moment, nothing else mattered. Margaret held her tightly. You're safe. Claire cried against her shoulder. I was so scared. Margaret closed her eyes. So was I. Claire pulled away. Mom. It's okay. No. Claire shook her head. It isn't. She looked toward Richard. Then toward Daniel. Finally, she looked at Margaret. There is something you need to know. Margaret waited. Claire wiped her tears. I wasn't taken by strangers. Everyone became still. What do you mean? Thomas asked. Claire pointed toward Richard. He sent them. Richard's face changed. That is a lie. Claire shook her head. He told them to scare me. Margaret stared at Richard. Why? Richard said nothing. Claire continued. He wanted me to convince you to sign the deed. Margaret's face became cold. Richard finally spoke. I never wanted her hurt, but you had her taken. I only wanted to frighten her. Thomas stepped forward. That is still a crime. Richard looked exhausted. His shoulders dropped. For the first time, he looked old. I lost everything because of that property. Margaret stared at him. You lost everything because of your choices. Richard looked at her. Your husband destroyed my business. No. Margaret shook her head. He refused to help you destroy yourself. Richard's eyes filled with anger. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. She stepped closer. My husband bought the land legally. You don't know what happened. I know what he left behind. Richard's expression changed. What did he leave? Margaret smiled faintly. Proof. She opened her handbag. Inside was the original deed. But there was something else, a small recording device. Thomas had given it to her before they left the office. Every word Richard had said in the meeting had been recorded. Every admission, every lie, every threat, and Claire's phone message had already been saved. Richard stared at the device. You planned this. Margaret shook her head. No. She looked at him calmly. You planned this. The police took Richard into custody. Daniel stood frozen. His father was led away. Claire watched silently. Then Daniel turned toward her. I am sorry. Claire looked at him. I don't know if I can forgive you. Daniel nodded. I understand. He removed his wedding ring. He placed it in Claire's hand. I should have told you about my father's debts. Claire looked down at the ring. You should have told me everything. I know. Then he walked away. Margaret watched him leave. Claire began crying again. Mom, I ruined everything. Margaret took her hand. You made terrible choices, I know. But you can still choose differently. Claire looked at her mother. Will you ever forgive me? Margaret did not answer immediately. She thought about the wedding, the security guard, the whispers, the old handbag, the words Claire had spoken. You make me look poor. Margaret still remembered how those words had felt. I don't know, she finally said. Claire nodded. I understand. They returned to the house later that night. Claire sat quietly in the kitchen, the same kitchen she had grown up in. She looked around. I forgot how small this place feels. Margaret smiled suddenly. It never felt small to me. Claire looked down. I was wrong. Margaret placed 2 cups of tea on the table. They sat in silence. Then Claire noticed a folder beside Margaret. What is that? Margaret looked at it. The deed. Claire's eyes dropped. The property. Yes. Claire hesitated. What are you going to do with it? Margaret looked toward the window. She had thought about that question for days. She could keep the property. She could sell it. She could use it to become wealthy. She could even give Claire another chance. But she remembered her husband's letter. She remembered why he had protected the land. Not for money, for Margaret's future. I am keeping the house, she said. Claire nodded. That makes sense. But I am not keeping everything. Claire looked confused. Margaret opened another folder. Inside was a new legal agreement. She had decided to sell part of the unused land. But the money would not go to Claire. It would go into a trust that would help single mothers pay for housing and education. Claire stared at the papers. Why? Margaret looked at her. Because I know what it is like to raise a child without enough money. Claire's eyes filled with tears. You're helping people like you. Yes. Margaret smiled. People who are simple. Claire began crying. Mom, I'm sorry. This time Margaret reached across the table. She held her daughter's hand. I know. It was not complete forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Months passed. Richard faced legal charges. The development company ended its agreement. Daniel's business collapsed. Claire moved out of the expensive apartment. She found a small job and began paying her own bills. For the first time in years, she learned how to live without depending on someone else's money. And Margaret, she remained in the old house. She kept her old furniture. She kept her late husband's photograph above the fireplace. She kept the old handbag Claire had once been ashamed of. One afternoon, Margaret stood in front of the mirror. She wore the same dark blue dress she had worn to the wedding. She smiled. The dress had never been the problem. Neither had the handbag. Neither had the old house. The problem had been people who believed value came from appearances. Margaret walked into her husband's study. She opened the metal box one last time. At the bottom was one final note. She had not noticed it before. It contained only one sentence. Margaret, if Claire ever learns the truth, make sure she learns the right lesson. Margaret stared at the words. Then she understood. Her husband had not only protected the property, he had protected her from becoming bitter. Margaret closed the box. The next Sunday, Claire came to visit. She did not arrive in an expensive car. She did not wear designer clothes. She carried a small paper bag with 2 homemade cakes. Margaret opened the door. Claire smiled nervously. I brought something. Margaret looked inside the bag. Your father used to love these. I know. They walked into the kitchen. For the first time in years, Claire looked comfortable there. No embarrassment. No shame. No concern about what anyone else might think. Just a daughter sitting beside her mother. Margaret poured the tea. Claire looked at her. Mom? Yes. Do you know what hurts the most? Margaret waited. I thought you had nothing. Margaret smiled softly. You were wrong. Claire nodded. I was. Margaret reached into a drawer. She pulled out the deed. Then she placed it on the table. Claire looked at it. You're giving it to me. Margaret shook her head. No. Claire looked surprised. Margaret smiled. I am giving you something more important. What? The chance to become someone who would never treat her own mother the way you treated me. Claire began to cry. Margaret pushed the deed back into the drawer. The property had made Margaret wealthy, but it had also taught her something worth more than money. People can judge a simple dress. They can judge an old handbag. They can judge a small house, but they cannot decide another person's worth. Claire had thrown her mother out of the wedding because she thought Margaret had nothing to offer. She had been wrong. Margaret had the deed. She had the truth. She had the evidence. And most importantly, she had the strength to walk away. The woman Claire once called too simple had quietly become the most powerful person in the room. And